we are right now enforcing powerful economic sanctions. We're cutting off Russia's largest banks in the international financial system, preventing Russia's central bank from defending the Russian ruble, making Putin's $630 billion war fund worthless.
We should prepare to lose our position as holder of the world's reserve currency. That is happening in slow motion. It's unmistakable. Now, the Biden people seem to have no idea this is going on, or maybe they want it to happen. Joe Biden was up there at the State of the Union bragging about how he took 30 points off the Russian ruble in a single day. Hooray, good for us! But once we stop celebrating our win, the destruction of the Russian economy, they deserve it. You gotta wonder, is there a downside to this?
This is why our leaders are so stupid. We basically confiscated the dollars out of the Russian central bank. That's not exactly safe and secure. Basically, countries are saying, wait a second, you can just confiscate our dollars? Like, we went after them and just grabbed the dollars and said, yep, they're no longer valid, converted into rubles. And Russia said, okay, well, that's an act of war, which it is.
I mean, look what the European Union just did with the sanctioned money from that they took from Russia. They didn't just sanction it, they now confiscated it, and they are using it to rebuild the Ukraine.
These policies have driven Russia, China, India, Turkey, and other countries to accelerate their flight from the US dollar. Now, to be clear, that's the majority of the global economy. This may be the most reckless and destructive thing any American president has ever done to the United States.
This channel, I talk about money, I talk about its moneytainment, about making money and all those things, but I think that it's so important to understand the political landscape to enhance your ability to make money, because the last thing you want to do is invest in a country when there's a war that's about to happen or there's a recession that's about to happen. So if you want to make the best financial decisions, you have to watch, the geopolitical landscape. You have to pay attention to politics, and you have to watch what's going on. And so that's why I took the time out to break some of these concepts for you, so you can see these different perspectives, but you can also see the opportunities that are arising. You're watching the University of Making Money, and I'm your host, Kenim O. And guys, I want to see at least 50 likes on this video, because if I don't see 50 likes, I'm not going to continue this series. Do you guys like the series, The Death of the Dollar? If you do, give us a like so I know that you guys want to see more episodes. I'm not getting enough likes, guys. And make sure you follow, you subscribe, because I see majority of you are not subscribed. Subscribe to this channel so I know that, hey, I should keep making content on this channel. Like this video and let's get into it.
A critical feature of a reserve currency is its apolitical nature, which Biden is now gutting. After both parties in Washington destroyed the dollar's stability with inflation, now the Biden administration has chosen to wield the dollar as a weapon. Together, these two factors send a message to foreigners, which is they should get out while they still can. In response to Russia's war with the Ukraine, the U.S. froze the dollar reserves of Russia's central bank. To be clear, these were not American assets. These were dollars owned by the Russian central bank and the Russian people. The seizure was intended to cause bank runs and collapse Russia's credit system. It didn't work. Instead, it exposed the Biden administration's willingness to violate the trillions of dollars that foreigners rightfully own. The danger of this precedent is difficult to overstate, end quote. These sanctions were never going to work in the way they promised because, unlike the United States, Russia does not have a late-stage finance economy. Russian oligarchs do not get rich from credit default swaps. They get rich from selling actual things that people need in order to live: oil, natural gas, iron, fertilizer, coal, wheat. By some measures, Russia has the largest resource economy in the world. Oh, okay. So they could barter if they needed to. So a year later, despite the sanctions you were told are the greatest ever devised, the Russian ruble is just as strong against the US dollar as it was before the war in Ukraine. So we didn't really hurt Russia with those sanctions, certainly not long term. Who'd we hurt? Ourselves.
And this is a very, very, very big problem. And when we go around trying to as an example, back the Ukraine with $114 billion that we had to borrow, it's crazy, including giving pensions to the Ukrainian government when there's a $1.75 trillion pension shortfall in this country. The world is saying these guys are out of their mind.
Zelensky is under fire for corruption. A new report says he embezzled the aid money. It was released by an American investigative journalist, Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He says Zelensky and his team have embezzled about $400 million. $400 million. Apparently, this was done last year. Take the case of this man, Timoshenko. He worked in Zelensky's office. Last year, he was seen driving around in an expensive SUV. 2 months later, another report came out. Also more embarrassing pictures. This is Timoshenko driving around in a Porsche Taycan. It's a $100,000 car, 100,000 US dollars. This is a man who worked in the president's office. He got a government salary and was living a life of luxury at a time when Russian forces were bombing his country.
So it's interesting to me how America is sending all of this money to Ukraine and the Ukrainian government is just blowing it. Ukraine is getting all these pensions, all this money, but Americans are homeless? America has a $31 trillion debt? It doesn't make sense. Why would you participate in a war that has nothing to do with us? It's crazy. It's insane. It's insane. We have to get out of this war. We have to stop funding Ukraine. It's not even a part of NATO. It's not our business. It's not our business. Ukraine is not our business. And then this propaganda that everybody has to support Ukraine, I don't care. I do not care. It's not my business.
I don't think people have really thought through the ramifications of our involvement in Ukraine.
So Russia announced it will conduct business in Asia, Africa, and Latin America in Chinese currency.
And then when Xi comes over and says, hey, I have a plan B for you in this currency thing, tell you what, let's take something really valuable. I've got it, energy.
Yeah, that's right.
I need energy, and energy has a hard unit of value coming out of the ground, just like gold does. And so what Xi did is he got value in the form of resources for the renminbi in a deal that looks like a trade deal, but it's a currency deal with Russia.
Right.
Brazil, which has a brand new government supported by the Biden administration, announced it will do the same thing. Brazil, largest economy in the hemisphere after ours. Pakistan is doing the same thing. That's a longtime U.S. ally. India and Malaysia, two of the biggest economies in the world, announced they'll be settling their trade in their own currencies, not the dollar.
And ultimately, what it comes down to is that the world is sick and tired. The world is no longer going to fund white supremacy. Point blank, period. Okay, white supremacy is an extreme term. What's a more lighter way of saying it? Because I know it can deter a lot of people, me saying white supremacist. But white preferring, is that nicer? Okay, so American society is white preferring, right? And there's this white preferring ideology that makes people just soak up all of that, and they don't realize that as they're pushing for the maintenance of the dollar, they don't really articulate what the dollar has done to other nations and how the dollar has oppressed other nations and how capitalism has not served, especially not black people. So, but at the end of the day, capitalism keeps certain groups poor, and America doesn't have the resources that back up its the dollar. You get me? America doesn't really have the resources. China has it, Russia has it, all these countries, they have it, but America doesn't have it like that. It doesn't have the manpower, the brains, but the brains will follow the money anyway. So the brains can leave this country if the money isn't here anymore. But I say all that to say that the world is no longer going to support and fund white supremacy. Don't you think it's ironic how, the war in Ukraine breaks out and the media coverage around that is, oh my God, we're seeing white people, European white people being, we're used to seeing Africans or Middle Easterners being attacked.
Relatively civilized.
They look like any European family.
Christians, they're white.
This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
When they say, oh, civilized cities, and in another clip, well-dressed people, and this is not the third world, they really mean white people, don't they?
No, how we have to defend whiteness. That's, if you ask me, that's the reason for the whole supporting of Ukraine by NATO.
A lot of this is centered on a border dispute on eastern Ukraine. All of this is, if that was not happening the way it was happening, a lot of these chips would not be falling into place, in my opinion. That is the beginning domino, because then Russia said, okay, screw you, we're going to grow closer to China. You know, we're no longer, for the first time ever, Russia has just dropped basically all their dollars out of the central bank because we made them when we put sanctions on them.
Smart foreigners, and there are some, believe it or not, started to dump the US dollar. Why? Because the US dollar was no longer a reliable store of value. And as a result, dollars began to look much less appealing to the rest of the world. And so de-dollarization began, and it has accelerated at remarkable speed, almost without comment in the American media, over the last year. Even France, which we liberated, is using Chinese currency in a new liquefied natural gas trade.
And look what this bastard does to us, the president of France. He goes over to China at the height of tensions, stabs us in the back, says he will not support us. He's provoking the Chinese to act, talks about autonomy. You can stick your autonomy, France, as far as I'm concerned.
He knows that the Chinese Communist Party is infiltrating his country in the same way that they're working in American universities. He knows that they've stolen billions of dollars worth of French intellectual property in the way they have stolen tens of billions of dollars of American intellectual property.
That the patent system is how white people colonize intellectual property. We would not have cell phones if it wasn't for the creation of the gamma electrical cell by black inventor Henry T. Sampson. And most of our cell phones would not have microphones in them if it wasn't for the particular microphone that was created by black inventor James Edward West. The cell phone in my hand came from China. So I don't know if you're referencing Steve Jobs or Martin Cooper or the Finnish inventor who created the first pocket-sized telecommunication device in 1917, and you probably don't know either because your education system has left you terribly ignorant and without the critical thinking skills necessary to effectively gather information. Because you believe that most great inventions can be attributed to one white person, the creation of the first digital network, 1G, was launched in Japan, and then black electrical engineer Jesse Russell pioneered the creation of 2G, which launched in Finland first. 3G launched in Japan, 4G launched in Norway, 5G launched in South Korea, and 30% of the world's cell phones are manufactured in China. Because we, of the global majority, recognize that collective humanity has the ingenuity and creativity of one another to thank, whereas a lot of European Americans are laboring under the delusion that the rest of us have white people to thank.
China, their alliance with Putin, their alliance with Iran, now the Saudis have chosen sides. They're now going with China and Russia and Iran.
China and Saudi Arabia are now major business partners. And again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is happening around the world, and all of it is shutting out the US dollar. So if you wanted the rest of the world to trust your currency, the last thing you would do is use it as a weapon or print too much of it. Printing too much of your currency causes inflation, and that saps the value of the currency. No one wants to hold a currency that is worth less consistently every year. That's sixth grade economics. But at this point, you begin to wonder, what does the United States have that will retain its value over time? We should do an inventory of our assets. So Biden, as you just saw, is continuing to send the contents of our treasury, our dollars, to corrupt oligarchs in Eastern Europe and around the world. And yet at the very same time, and you should pay attention to this, he's selling off America's most valuable hard asset. That's our strategic petroleum reserve. Because unlike the US dollar, oil, which is in the reserve, has inherent value. Oil is the densest store of transportable energy known to man. So unlike fiat currencies like the dollar, oil will always have value. That's why Russia is not now impoverished, because they have a lot of oil. But we have less because the SPR has been drained. In the last fiscal year, the Biden administration sold off 218 million barrels of oil, including bewilderingly, criminally, to the government of China. How much oil is that? It's more oil sold from the SPR in 1 year than in all previous years combined. So what happens when we empty it? Well, there's not much left. But what about our gold? America's gold reserves have not been fully audited in generations. So they can say whatever they want, but the truth is we don't really know how much gold is in Fort Knox.
I'm going to try to help explain to the American people that defeating the Russians in Ukraine is the single most important event going on in the world right now.
Defeating the Russians in Ukraine is not the single most important event in the world from the perspective of the United States. It's not even number 15 on the list. It's way below ending the importation of fentanyl into this country, and it's way, way below preserving the strength of the US dollar. But if Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden and the rest of these reckless leaders have their way, an increasing number of countries will do what so many have already done, which is begin to reject the US dollar. And what will happen then? Well, all those dollars will come home, and the value of our currency will plummet even further. And that will lead to poverty across the United States, and that will lead to the typical political and cultural volatility that inevitably follows economic collapse, disaster. And we've seen it before. Of course, you know the famous pictures from Germany in the early 20s. Banknotes and wheelbarrows. When I buy a cup of coffee, that'll be 30 pounds of currency. Kids playing with worthless stacks of Deutschmarks. That was called Weimar, the Weimar Republic. And that government collapsed because of hyperinflation. And then economic collapse led to communist revolutions across Germany and ultimately to, fill in the blank, the Nazi regime.
For example, in the 1920s, the Weimar government printed over 500 billion paper marks. And in just 3 years, inflation rate in Germany got so bad that at its worst, it took 4.2 trillion paper marks just to buy $1 US. Similarly, when Venezuela printed 4 trillion bolivars, by 2020, their inflation rate reached over 4,200%.
If you need proof of how bad it is in Venezuela right now, look at this purse. This purse is made entirely of the bills of the Venezuelan currency, the bolívares. Inflation is so high that this money is now completely worthless. And so my friend Jorge over here has gathered a ton of this stuff and turned it into commodities, into purses, into sculptures.
It is worse than it sounds, and it sounds pretty bad.
The country's inflation rate will rise to 1,000,000%.
The collapse of Venezuela didn't happen because of a civil war or a natural disaster, but rather the colossal economic mismanagement by the country's leader, Nicolás Maduro. In just a few years, Maduro grabbed control of most of the government and then drove the country into an economic disaster worse than the Great Depression and the fall of the Soviet Union.
And guess what? In 2020, the United States of America printed $3 trillion in just 3.5 months. But guess what? Strangely, while in other cases of currency printing, those countries experienced hyperinflation, in case of US, inflation barely touched 9%. In fact, this had a reverse effect whereby instead of inflation increasing just in the US, inflation actually got exported to other countries all across the world.
Why did the German government blow up its own currency? Well, simple. The German government took on too much debt in order to pay for a pointless war. Yes, a pointless war did that. And if that sounds familiar, it's because exactly what we have done repeatedly for decades. We did it in Vietnam. We did it in Iraq. We did it in Afghanistan. And every time we got away with it because uniquely we held the world's reserve currency. But this time could be very, very different. A war against Russia will be the last war we can afford to fight.